Welcome to the Funnel Reboot Podcast, brought to you by Marketing What's New. Let's get into today's show.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome to Funnel Reboot. Today, you'll be taught the right way to talk to customers. First, please note that Google's Universal Analytics is going away. The deadline until they remove it is rapidly approaching, and you need to allow some time for having that new data that you would get through the replacement GA4 alongside of Universal. There are a number of tricky parts to this, but I don't want you to feel stumped. There are episodes of this podcast available, and I've got lots of other resources. So please, if you have a question, reach out. Let's get to today's show. We spend a lot of time making professions of who our company is built around. We demonstrate what they mean to us by leaving an open chair for them in board meetings. We put mottos on the footer of our website. We provide automated feedback mechanisms so we can gauge how they feel. And when we hold in-person events or trade shows where they're going to be, we make every effort to give them swag and confirm their upcoming purchase plans, which hopefully include us. I'm talking of customers, of course. And though we do all these things, there seems to be one thing that we dance around, the one simple activity that could give us the most intelligence on them: talking to them. And I'm not saying we don't talk to customers, but most of that talk is anecdotal. I don't know about you, but as a marketer, I wouldn't be comfortable going to a C-suite and defending a marketing program and budget based on a customer's anecdotal comment. But done in the right way, that's systematic, that follows qualitative research principles, talking to customers can take a statistically significant pulse of our market. And we can analyze those experiences and make those findings available. And it can be done in a way that would not only stand up to an executive scrutiny, but they'd come to insist on basing more corporate decisions on this information. I've got the perfect person to tell us how to do it. Over his 20 years in marketing, he's worked with dozens of businesses overseeing programs from the bootstrapped variety on up to $1 million budget variety. Using skills he got in his career when he worked in TV and radio and film, including a stint as a reporter for Canada's public broadcaster, the CBC, he got really used to interviewing. And he just kept doing it. And he figures that he's now conducted over 1,800 interviews. He now heads up Content Lift, a marketing strategy consultancy centered around customer research. So please welcome back for a second time to Funnel Reboot, Ryan Gibson. I'm glad to welcome back Ryan Gibson. Welcome to Funnel Reboot, Ryan.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you mentioned I'm only one of a handful that's been welcomed back, so I feel pretty honored.
Yeah, perfect. I think it's 5 punches of the ticket and free coffee at the nearest coffee place where I happen to be.
I will take that. Honestly, Glenn, in today's economy, deal. Sold.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So, Ryan, to get right to the subject here and to a field of expertise, which you have, we're talking about customer interviews. We're talking about being able to get valid research, which can be shared internally in order to have, let's say, executive sponsors understand direction, understand current issues, understand new marketing opportunities or whole new markets. These are things that, they exist, but they're not thought of as often as things like a quick little poll that somebody has popping up in the bottom corner of a website, or someone saying, well, we've got our analytics stats. We can just look at how many people come to which pages. Those kind of, or just casual observations, especially from the higher ups who say, oh, well, I was at a client site last week and they said, how do you respond to those and say, but that doesn't quite still do what interviews do?
Mm-hmm. Well, what you're talking about is, a lot of those hard metrics, right, that we rely on in business to make decisions, and all that stuff's very important. Maybe just to sort of back it up a bit, like I focus on B2B, and when you get started, oftentimes the preliminary research is around the product or the service. Like, what does that look like? What's the outcome we want them to have? How are you facilitating getting to the point A to point B? Sometimes not, though, even too, right? Sometimes we just start a thing and launch. So where I find research comes in, though, it uncovers all sorts of things that you didn't realize were important in the market for either building awareness or bringing your solution or product into an evaluation set, or then actually closing the deal, right? Because we don't, in B2B, people, what I often say is we just don't wake up and buy a thing. There is a gradual tipping of the scales that happens that push people towards solutions over time. Sometimes that timeline is 3 weeks. Sometimes that timeline is 3 years. It's all very relative to sort of the business model and where they are in the maturity of their growth. So if you don't understand all those steps that people are taking before they even start looking for solutions and why, and then every concurrent step they take into, identifying and paying for something, you're not going to do a very good job at, marketing to a market, as I'll say sometimes. So to circle it back to your question, a survey won't tell you that, right? Dashboards won't tell you that. They won't tell you all those steps that consumers or buyers take to get to that endpoint where you want them to become a buyer and then a customer. It's qualitative research is what I focus on through interviews. And you can still do some surveys around that, but that's breadth, not depth. So I lean on this type of research to really map out how do we make better choices as a business to ensure we're spending our capital wisely in all our marketing and sales activities. Does that answer sort of what do you have?
Yeah, the only thing that I might add is that I feel, my opinion, the things like you'll sometimes see at the bottom of an email, or if you're in a kind of a support ticket kind of environment, you'll see the three faces, the sad face, the neutral face, and the happy face, and they ask how we're doing. So it's just, we don't want to misconstrue that individual client, individual stage of the client lifecycle pulse check as research, like macro level research that's going to tell us what all of them think.
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is sort of like an NPS score, right?
Yeah.
I think some people call it that. And that's fine. I don't knock those. But what that does is it gives you an aggregate of, are people satisfied at the end stage of the journey at that point? Right.
Yes.
Depending on your business model, you might have recurrent customers that recur over time, and you're introducing new features, and they're adopting new features, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a very different type of metric and a different type of insight than the insights around, how do I get into a market and influence buyers who don't know me? Right. Like, that's different data that you need to sort of solve those equations. Are we doing a good job in keeping people around? Great. How do we get this started in the first place? It's different. You're gathering data for those answers in different ways.
Yeah. And if your objective is to divine that direction, those hard metrics that you're getting, those individual metrics, you can look till the cows come home. You're not going to find it.
Yeah.
There's no substitute for individual ones. The only area where these two things resemble each other, I think you'd agree, is that by doing interviews with customers, you have to sample. And so you are doing individual interviews. You mentioned something like in the range of maybe 12 to 30 of them. that is going to be used to represent the entire client population. So you are actually taking individual, snippets from people, but it's for a completely different purpose. It is to imagine what the entire client population would go for if you put it out there.
Pretty much. I mean, and you don't even need that many. There's a lot of thought process around how many people do you need to talk to. Different qualitative researchers actually have different opinions on this. Here's where we're going to get super nerdy, Glenn. There are qualitative research studies on the size of the best qualitative research samples out there. Like it's just, most people would not care,
You've gone full
at all.
Inception on us. Yeah,
most people wouldn't care at all about that. I understand why. I care about it. I find it fascinating because this is all the work that I do now. But the reason I mention that is there's a key term you have to understand when it comes to customer research when you're looking at qualitative insights, and that term is insight saturation. What that means is after a certain number of interviews or within a certain population size, after getting insights from them, there'll be a tipping point at which you start hearing the same things over and over again, and the amount of new learnings drops dramatically. So if you plotted everything on a bell curve, it's where it comes over on the other side.
It plateaus.
Yeah. Correct. So when you look at some of the research around what sample sizes around where that saturation starts to happen, it actually starts around 7 to 8 interviews for most research. So after you've talked to about your 8th customer, you'll start to hear some of the same things over and over again. Now, here's where I say there's some variations in there, right? So the first one is how much time do you have? Because most companies won't want to do 30 to 40 interviews and run that over the course of 2 quarters and try and get all the insights. Because the more interviews you do, the more you have to parse data. Because it's not like if we go back to surveys or dashboards, all that is aggregated in an instant for you.
Correct.
Right. And it's shallow data. Qualitative is very depth, but you have to sort of, create order out of chaos, if you will. Yeah. So the more interviews you have, the more data you got to work with. So most companies don't have time. And the second one is it depends on the complexity of what you're trying to understand. So if you have, let's say, you have a large piece of software and it's, spread out across an organization with 2 to 3 users, and maybe there's 2 other people involved in the buying decision over the course of 8 months.
Like a committee. Yeah.
Correct. That might be an instance where you need to do a few more other than 7 or 12, right? Because you have to account for these 2 or 3 different roles that have different objectives in organization, different priorities in organization, different viewpoints about what progress or success looks like. There'll be some overlap, but there'll also be distinctions because you might have to market to both of these 2 personas equally, right? It all depends on sort of what your market looks like in your product. That said, though, I still always tell clients, if you're doing this for the first time, 7 to 12 is probably your sweet spot with what we would call the champion or the core power user or whoever's around the most, right? If you want to use it in lay terms. And then you can start there. Because if you interview 7 to 12 of those people and you've done a really good job at creating a research objective that's very tight, very specific with all the things that you want to understand, and you've found people that are similar in firmographics and psychographics from a sample set, like they're similar buyers.
Yes.
You'll have a really good sampling of a market around the research objectives that you're trying to understand if you do your job right.
Perfect. And we'll cling to that hope. I mean, that is really, how do I put this? I think that at least the experience I have in organizations has been that the desire to do this kind of qualitative research, it doesn't just spring up out of nowhere, especially if everything is, as my aunt used to say, tickety-boo. The reality is it's like when you've finished a quarter where you were way off of meeting a KPI, or where a new market entry is not happening in the way that you thought it would. It's moments like that where we say, okay, we must first let go of the illusion that we know what the market is saying, and we have to go and ask them.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So when you're doing that, just if I can kind of bring us into, we kind of covered a little bit of the who, but maybe let's talk a little bit about the how, the mechanics. Imagine we've got this pool of people, and that we're maybe trying to do this in-house. We are ready to do our interviews here. You tell us actually that what we've got to do is we're not immediately going to stampede towards individual questions. You have a particular way of approaching how to arrive at questions, but we don't start with questions. Can you take us through that?
Yeah. So I'll talk about how I do it, and then maybe other ways people can do it, because there's actually, again, like most things, different ways you can approach it. So I like to start with setting I called it a research objective just a few minutes ago. And that's really just sort of an equation of what is it you want to understand, from who do you want to understand this from, and what do you want to do with that information, right? Like that's really the three parts of the equation. And it sounds simplistic, but what that actually does is it helps guide the entirety of the research and the discussions you have with people. And I'll give a few rationales as to why you want to do that. Now, first is if anyone has ever been on a conversation with a customer, as sort of like a fly on the wall, or even if you conduct it yourselves, they can go in all sorts of different directions, because there's different things that are impacted, that we impact each other in multitudes of ways when we're a customer and the vendor or the service provider. The challenge is for what we want to do, which is research, versus just, having a catch up, which is often what we do with clients. Hey, I just want to catch up how things are going. This is a different setting. This is not that objective. Your objective here is I have a challenge that I want to overcome, or there's insights that I need to make informed decisions about the business in a specific way. I want to structure the conversation around that. So I take that research equation, and then I will list out, okay, well, what are all the things that I need to understand to answer this research objective? Or what are all the topics and themes that I want to cover off within this objective, right? So some of them are going to be similar to what we would do normally when we have a catch-up, but a lot of it is very specific to what we want to understand. So as an example, I just ran a series of interviews to help a tech company out of the United Kingdom, their startup, validate whether they're a market for their technology, a buyer in a market. It was an AI solution, and their product and their technology, they believe they can measure sentiment and emotion in real time. So they wanted to talk to senior product managers within companies who are selling to B2C. So it's a B2B relationship, but that other business who would be their customer is actually a B2C company with potentially, wearable technology. But we didn't just have to we found those people, but we also had to understand things like, did they even care about sentiment and emotion? Was that even in their mindset when they built products or evaluated the use of these products and the success of these products? So you can see already, I'm not going to talk too much about, how they procure new software tools. A little bit. I'm not going to talk too much about, how their developer team builds and launches products. I want to talk about, they care about emotion and sentiment? How do they measure the user journey? How do they define success in that? What do they do as a senior product manager? See, that already is going to take up half an hour, right? So that's what I mean by I don't start with questions, because if you just start listing out random questions, it's going to get you nowhere. So I start with the objectives. I start with those themes, and then what I will do after that is I will add some prompt questions within each of those sub themes and sub objectives to get the conversation going. That That's how I do it, Glenn. I could talk about other people,
Yeah.
but that's
Yeah.
I found is the best way for people when they get started. It really helps them guide, all that time in a conversation.
And it brings you back to, and we're going to jump for a very quick moment to the very end of the process, where you've got boatloads of recorded transcripts. If you follow that method, that in there will be the gold that will answer the original objective. Nobody wants to get to the end of this whole exercise and say, I've got a lot of information, but it doesn't answer my question.
Yeah, and that's often what happens, right? Because sometimes people there's so many things that happen with humans when they're in this particular setting. I'm sure you experience, right? You probably notice halfway through a podcast conversation, people start recalling things that they didn't think of in the first 10 minutes of the conversation. Because what's happening is their brain is starting to go back and recall all these things that transpired because you're activating their memory, right? With all these specific questions you're asking. It's a similar environment where you might get to minute 35 and they say things like, you know what? You just made me remember this. Because what might have happened was maybe a year ago. So I have this type of structure so that you account for the fact that people don't always remember things right away. Sometimes they struggle with answers. Sometimes they're skeptical of what they can say, or they're concerned about what they can say, or apprehensive about what they can say. There's all these things that are happening in real time when you interview people. But if you've never done this work before, it's really hard to understand. You don't know that these things are going to happen. Like, you probably didn't start picking up on these things until your 20th, 30th podcast, right? All these things that people do in the course of having dialogue with them.
Yeah.
So I like the structure because it keeps it nice and tight for people. But there are interviewers and researchers that have no questions. I know them. They go out and they just ask one question. They'll say things like, let's start at the time you decided to spend money on a solution. What did you do first?
Yeah.
And I can do that, but I find that it gets a little meandering. So anyway, you're about to say something, but there's different ways to go about it, but that's what I like.
Yeah, well, and I'll come to that specific example with the AI company because you brought it up. And I think the important thing that listeners should take from what you've said is that there is, even if it seems like a casual conversation, it can kind of move. It is going to part ways a little bit with something like, let's say, a podcast where I'm trying purely to educate, so I'm literally wringing Ryan out like he's a sponge. But the place you want to go, it would be maybe, I think, closer to, let's say, what a prosecuting attorney is doing when there's a witness on the stand. There are definitely ways in which, and if we even think of what we've seen on TV of courtrooms, there are things that are not allowed. There are and you also call out some of those. So it's, even when it gets into something that people maybe haven't fully embedded into their product currently, what you're going to probe for are things that have already happened, where they have either shown a certain behavior, taken a certain action, or there is some kind of a fact, even a yes-no decision at a certain place and time on something, right? And you're kind of going at it with that dogged determination that prosecuting attorney would have. You are not getting them into hypotheticals. You're not getting them into things where you can engineer them to say something you want, right?
Yeah.
Like you make it very clear.
Yeah, because hypotheticals are a waste of money. To be frank, right? The challenge is a business is a hypothetical. It's a bet in a market. So it's
we've already got enough risk.
Yeah, it's a hypothesis that you can generate revenue doing X service or Y product. The challenge is, Glenn, though, when you ask people if they want things, they almost always say yes, or they almost always say no. If they don't understand it, you haven't done a good job explaining it. And that happens. I've seen people do that. One of the clastic challenges I see from founders or early stage companies when I meet with them, they'll say, I'm having a hard time getting people to give me feedback on this product or they're interested in it. So we walk through sort of their process for getting in front of people. And what they do is they just show everyone the technology and they say, would you buy this?
Yeah.
And it sounds like
What's wrong with
it
that?
should be, it sounds like it should be a very straightforward way to do it. The challenge is people typically will say, yeah, that looks great because it's a hypothetical. Oh, I would definitely buy that. But then I've heard this from founders. They go back 2 weeks later and say, okay, it's
Here's
ready.
the PO.
It's going to be $200 a month. And people, are now sort of backtracking because it makes it real. What you haven't done, though, you haven't tried to understand like what their actual problems are. How do they solve? So this thing that you think you're going to help them progress in,
Sure.
This challenge, or how I look at it is, good services and solutions remove barriers. For you, that could be Google Analytics just launched. I have no idea what, and the new GA4. What is this thing? I want to jump off a building. Oh my God. You remove the barrier for them, right? So there's value in that. So you need to understand as either a founder or a marketer or a salesperson, what are those barriers? How do they articulate those? What is the priority of those barriers? Because sometimes, Glenn, the product solution you have is a pain, but it's not a priority. So, what you need to understand how they think about these things before you present a solution to solve these things. Because maybe when they say, "Oh yeah, that looks cool," they're just trying to get you off their back because what they're really saying is, "Yeah, that looks cool, but it's not for me." Hope you find someone that works for. Right. So you can't ask people directly, would you buy this? Now, the caveat I have, though, is sometimes I do ask them, hypotheticals, but they're always with a grain of salt. And I say that because I might ask things like, what would have to be true in the business next year for you to churn out of this product? Now, it's still hypothetical, right? But at least gives you a sense of, what sort of things they're thinking about in the business next year, Another way to put it is when you're looking for 2023, would we be one of the products that you would churn from or discontinue using if there was a challenging road ahead, and why?
Yeah.
Right. So
they're hitting the criteria in their head at that point. They're remembering back to the last time that they did a similar decision. So they're going to have to speak to that.
Absolutely. But hypotheticals are nothing but, I always say, like a waste of money. And, it's hope as a strategy.
Yeah, no, hope is no strategy. No, and yet we can find out what our customers think. We're going to get more into the mechanics of actually conducting customer interviews. But before we do that, we're going to take a really quick break. I'm taking a moment to talk about the soon-to-be retired Google Universal Analytics, or UA. The new Google Analytics product is missing a lot of UA reports. You may think you're stuck using the GA4 interface to make them, but there's another way Google is giving you your data. It can feed reports and even be merged with your other marketing data in a dashboard. You know your data best. That's why you're the best person to set this up. But you don't have to do it alone. I've reduced the process down to something marketers can do inside of a 2-day workshop. Whether you've installed Google Analytics 4 or not, this will fully migrate all of your old UA settings and get you implemented on Google's stack of database and dashboard tools. In early 2023, the in-person GA Fast Forward workshops will happen in Ottawa, Kingston, Montreal, as well as across upstate New York and Vermont. You can go now and see registration details. Just go to gafastforward.com. Spelled as you'd say it, or GA-FAST, the number 4, then WARD. Let's get back to the conversation. Okay, Ryan, I'm going to start off with imagining that we're doing the interview. So, listeners here, marketers, people in maybe they're either agency side or client side, doesn't matter, but they're in definitely a customer-facing role. So they have their eye on the revenue the company makes. They have a horse in the race, but they're being asked, even despite that economic motivation, to speak with a customer and to tease out the insights. So I guess I'll come right out and ask, is it cool or not cool for this person conducting this interview to work in a commercial pitch for the product?
Oh. No, it's cool. I do it. Because
when would you do it?
Oh, at the very end.
Ah.
Because, I've done it too. I do it sometimes it depends on my read of the person. So I'm going to because I can put my sales and marketing hat on now because, I'm a researcher now, but, I've still had to sell stuff in my career. And a lot of that, if you talk to any really good salesperson, a lot of time it's just reading the room, right? So you read the room at the end, and if it's been a really good conversation and they come to it and say, what is it that you have?
Right. How could you help?
Yeah, I'm really curious now. Now, when I just did this last slate of interviews, that I was talking about the example I gave of the AI product, it was product management people, product people. So they're tasked with helping developers build things. So of course they're interested in new technology, right? They have a bias towards it. But because we just spent an hour talking about their problems and how in the world are they trying to solve these specific problems that I care about, and they don't necessarily know why I want to know about them, but I'm asking about them, then that could be an opportunity to say, listen, here's the thing we're doing. Can we just show it to you? Because you have a lot of really good thoughts on this topic. We'd love your feedback. That's it.
Okay.
Right? And it's not a sales conversation, right? Still yet, because you don't know if they're going to buy it. Or you could say, listen, I have a thing. We've been helping people just like you. Can I just leave this with you? Let me know what you think. I'll come back in a week and just see what you think.
Well, and I think this is important for basic trust. If they have at the end, and we mean we're going to keep it really short and sweet at the end, where we do say something that can be used by them. Here's something I'm going to leave with you. Here's a trial login, whatever.
Yeah.
I think that hits the right note. What would not hit the right note, and I'm sure what would probably cause people in your profession to be very annoyed, would be if there were a landslide of folks that were masquerading as interviewees when they're actually doing demo calls. That's like the wolf in sheep's clothing, right?
Yeah.
So that is not cool.
No, yeah, I put that when I reach out to people. I put that right in the email or the reach out.
Right.
Like, this is not a sales call. I've even started saying, and I promise at the end of it, you will not see a demo from me, right? Like, that's just not what it is. And, one of the really nail it home, Glenn, so I do this type of work for companies, right? Larger scale software companies and large agencies now. And regardless of the vertical, when you ask people what convinced them to choose the vendor they chose, other than, peer recommendations, case studies, things like that, there's all these things that they put together to land on the one they choose. But the two criteria when they get into evaluations face to face, the first one is they understood me the best, and two is I trusted them the most. Right? So it's trust is huge. And if you, at that evaluation phase, or that word when it's very personal, right? Because that's what the customer interview is, or the buyer interview is what I'll call it sometimes, trying to understand a market. If you erode that trust out of the gate, you ain't really getting it back, because people are very sensitive to it.
Yeah. It's an intangible, and even though there is money changing hands, this is not as base and transactional. In that way, I can almost liken it to, personal relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So this is, all of us would know how to go and get what we could get from a personal relationship via a transaction, but it ain't the same.
Yeah.
On that note, joking with the prostitution reference, is the notion of incentivizing people to come on to an interview, or to using places outside of a customer list to go get folks going to you. You say that you can sometimes look at review sites.
Yep.
You can sometimes use your own LinkedIn personal network. So, is there anything that you would suggest we need to keep in mind when we're sending that missive in to get them, if it's, they're a complete stranger, or we're realizing that we may have to dole out some dollars or a gift card to get them on? How do you approach that one differently from how you would do it if there's a list of candidates who are merely waiting for you to book the call?
Yeah. It's interesting because I've actually, over the last couple of years, as I've done this work, I've sort of changed my mind about incentivization. I would have said, nah, you don't need to do it. But here's the thing, getting people is the hardest part.
Yeah.
And I say that every single
time. It's prospecting, right?
It is. Even with
just
your own
different type.
Even with your own customers, Glenn. Like, think of the time we're in right now. I have a couple of interviews booked for clients this week, but some of them, it's like the third time they've rescheduled because it's Q4 for most companies.
Right. Yeah.
They are strapped for time. So even if they want to help you, and most customers do, they might not have time.
Yeah.
So how I look at incentivization is such. First, when you do reach out, you should be very, if you're just reaching out through social networks or, reaching out cold through maybe communities, email, what have you, be very clear about who you are, what you're doing. So you're doing research, not selling anything. What do you want to talk about? And be clear on the offer that you're incentivizing.
Yes.
There is a range of thoughts around what the amount should be, but in a B2B professional environment, for someone that's probably, say, mid to senior management, let's just say, you're probably starting now anywhere from like 90 to 100 US for 45 minutes to an hour of their time.
Yep.
The higher you go up the food chain, the more money you are probably going to be doling out. I have spent as high as $400 US to speak to a senior director at Ubisoft, right? So, that's a massive international video game. And because their LinkedIn's blowing up all day long, right? So that has to be worth their time, especially like their equivalency of what they're getting per hour. Because here's a way to frame it, Glenn. It's almost like a call, right? You are taking up their time to get their industry expertise and their experience and their understanding of certain scenarios. That's what you would do for someone, and that's what you do, right? People reach out to you and you get compensated for your time, for your expertise. It's the same type of thing. It's just in a different type of, mind. It's just a different way of going about it. So I would say you probably want to start anywhere from $90 to $100 and go from there. And there's if you can't find anyone, there's great sites that I use like respondent.io, userinterviews.com. And what those are sites that have aggregated populations of professionals or B2C users. Sure. They enter all their firmographics, psychographics, professional backgrounds. Sometimes they connect their LinkedIn, and you just put in here's what I'm looking for, and then the machine goes and finds those people, and then you can set the parameters and incentivize them. Why I like that now, and here's the thing. So why I've come around on incentivization is, since this is all the work I do now, and people want insights quicker rather than later, I've booked a slate of interviews through these sites, like a cohort sample size within a week, right? Yeah. Or sometimes it's taken me 5 weeks to get everybody.
Yeah, and so 5 follow-ups on each.
Sometimes. So, there's
something to be said for that panel approach.
Yeah.
What I've heard of is this was done by Pete Blaja. It's called Winter, but Winter, WYNTER.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, marketers should actually glom onto this quickly. You would do this for an A/B experiment, right? Like how it's not different. It's a different kind of engagement, but the premise is the same.
Yeah.
Hey, I want you to see this thing, and I want you to, indicate either by your clicks or some other measure,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
a poll popping up. But I want to know what problem this is potentially solving for you. And people need to, for that moment that they're the expert in the room, they probably do act a little differently if there's some money in it.
I think so.
They'll prioritize it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they'll just push you off.
They might. Customers still want to help, but they're still a great source, right? Don't get me wrong, because it's specific to your company, right, and your business.
Yes.
So that's always the best avenue. But if you wanted to sprinkle in some of these people who are maybe out of your market, maybe have never heard of you, right, and you understand how they think. So there's all sorts of ways you can leverage these communities, or just leverage different people who are not your customer to your advantage for insights around qualitative research.
Let's get to the heart of when you're asking questions and what the basic flow of the discussion is.
Yeah.
I think there are things that average people like me get tripped up on if they're hearing from someone. We all have the tendency to do this. We're busy thinking of what we're going to say next. We have.
I'm doing that this whole time, Glenn.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was doing it the other day at a cocktail party, so we're even. We really can't help ourselves.
Yeah.
You say you've just got to fight that urge. You instead need to lean into, and what I found from a recent thing that you'd sent me that was very eye-opening to me was you need to lean into silence. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that, from when I was a little boy on up, I was not taught that. I was taught in a social situation to make the other people feel at ease. You should, fill the silence with talk. But this is one of those cases where you have to forget that.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive because most people are like you. And I learned that I learned this when I was a reporter, right? I used to be a reporter, TV and radio. And this is where I really was able to learn a lot about how you talk to people, especially the investigative side, because you mentioned before a bit sort of like an investigative attorney. And if you speak to attorneys or police officers, anyone who's in that type of like discovery work, it is very much almost like they're trying to get that timeline of events and actions and behaviors. It's almost linear in their mind. They're trying to create the timeline. And I do very similar things in my work. But one of the things I was always taught, and they teach journalism students this as well, is silence is uncomfortable, but it gets you the quality answers. So and what happens sometimes is, if I stop talking now, you can start to feel the need to fill the air, right? But if you ever listen to any really good radio interview, the host will let that silence breathe. And what happens is in that environment, I have clips of this. I have a course which I call How to Run Customer Research Interviews That Don't Suck, a DIY guide. There's a whole reason for the names. But I show you examples of this where you just let people stop. They talk, they stop, and then you let the silence breathe, and they start again. Because they're the ones filling that silence now. And that's where they might give you that extra nugget of gold, right? It's an old trick as a reporter that I would use and other people use. So silence is key. And also, you mentioned just a few minutes ago, just waiting to ask the next question. That's what we do, right? When I started as a reporter, I remember one of my very first interviews, how I was looking at my list of questions, which is why I also advise against it. Because if you have like 50 questions listed out, you get hyper focused on the questions, and you're so afraid to miss one.
Or how far you are through. Oh my gosh,
yeah.
We've only got this much time left, and I have these many questions.
It freaks you out. You start to get anxious. So what happens is you stop listening to the answers, and you start focusing on the questions. But then when I went back to the studio and listened to my tape, there was this incredible thing they said that I should have asked a follow-up question on, and I missed that opportunity. And I still remember that day. That was almost 10 years ago. And it still happens in my work today. Don't get me wrong, I'm not perfect, but I'm much better now at letting the conversation just naturally take its course. And then what I do is, and this is what I've been able to practice over the course of the years, is because I have those research objectives I said with those sub themes, as I'm talking, if they just naturally cover off something, I go to my list and I cross it off because they've brought it up on their own accord. Right. So, active, they call it active listening is the term for it. And if you can, those two things, active listening and practicing silence, leaning into silence, if you can just even get those down, man, you're going to see just dramatic leaps in the stuff you're able to do in that environment.
Oh, I'll go even farther. I'll say that you'll be better at having conversations in general with people.
Yes. Yeah, you will.
That next promotion you're looking for, or that next, opportunity where, just whatever, work level, personal level. If you slow down enough to hear them say, to me, it kind of resembles a road where, I may have the place where I think the destination is, but let's say that I'm talking to a local and I'm from out of town. Well, why wouldn't I, if we happen to be going by an exit and they say, oh, you know what's down there? And they said it, not me, but I allowed, I wasn't zooming. I was slowing down enough that I could get off. Then yeah, let's go there. Right? Let's see that place that could be fantastic. And you only mentioned it because I gave you the space to do it.
I like that. That's a good analogy, Glenn.
So you don't want us to kind of be so rigid in our types of questioning. Yeah. But you also say that we got to be careful. The word that is most often used to get those deeper insights is why.
Yes.
And you're cautious. You say to use it sparingly. Mm-hmm. So tell me about that and tell me how we can kind of do the same thing as what a why question would do, but not with saying it.
So why is what they would call a probing question, but it's the top one, right? There's even, people write books about the power of why. And we use that question, or we use that probing question because I mentioned people often give curt answers, or what I'll say is sometimes there's not a lot of depth to what they're saying, right? They're vague in their answers. So why is the best way to start peeling back the layers? Because they might say, oh, and that made me so frustrated, the most frustrated I've been in my career. Interesting. Why did that make you the most frustrated? Why that thing? It's a probing question. Here's the thing, and again, it comes back to my days as a journalist. If you keep asking people why they do things, it can start to feel like an interrogation. Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? I mean, there is an interview technique called the 6 whys, and it is literally what it sounds like. You're asking why 6 times in a row, but I've never liked it because it sounds a little, it's rough. It's like sandpaper to me.
I would expect it on like 60 Minutes where a public figure is being sweated.
Yeah. But that's not what we want here. We want a safe space. We want them to feel, I always say it's not a friendly chat. Like it's not that check-in with a client, but it should feel like that, right? Like that's the vibe. So you can, instead of asking why as a probing question, you can ask things like, let's have the same example. I was so frustrated. Most frustrated I've been in my career. Oh, that's interesting. Walk me through that. Where is this frustration coming from? Or no one's said that before. Can you dig into that a little more? I'd really like to understand.
Dig in. Yeah. Expand.
Can you expand? Like just different ways to phrase it. It seems like such a trite thing, right? Well, don't try to not ask why. But it again, you're trying to create an environment where they feel it's okay to share. You're asking a lot of people to talk for an hour. Not everyone is used to doing it, right? Especially to someone they've never met. So, you want to create that sort of reciprocity and that sense of trust we talked about, that safe spot that they can have that dialogue. And, that's just a small tweak that you can use to sort of, keep that vibe going the way you want it to go.
Yeah. Well, we've been like taking marketers just on this call and kind of placing them briefly into other occupations. We've already mentioned the lawyer. We've already mentioned the one I think you've just brought up, interrogation, is a police officer. But
Yeah.
the one I think of, and this is going way back, maybe some listeners are not old enough to remember this, is Columbo.
Oh,
So
yeah.
here's an inspector.
Yeah.
He is able to put the cuffs on you, but his manner for bringing things out, it echoes the way you've been speaking already. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
I don't quite, I really need help getting a bit more on how that all went.
Yeah.
And here's the crazy part about it is the human mind, even in a situation where someone stands to, incriminate themselves, if it's done in a space where they feel that they can talk to another person, then you're going to get to what they really think. And I think that's part of what these interviews largely do, is they're able to get past the trappings of, here's what I think I'm supposed to say.
Yeah.
Here's what I want you to hear me say. Here's what my attitude would be, even though my behavior contradicts it.
Yeah.
You have to push gently beyond all those other, those things that have to do with status or, what they, again, suppose their first talking point should be, and get down to the things where they're telling you what they really in their heart of hearts feel and will do.
I think so. It's they're not going to give it to you right away. Some people do. Some interviews are great. Some people are hard to talk to, right? So you need
have to do them all regardless.
Yeah. It's like any other thing. You need tools to get the job done, right? And those are all just tools. Everything we've talked about, those are all just tools to get the job done and getting the most insights out of a customer interview setting.
The one area we haven't covered, just a very quick one. What's your advice for someone once they have finished interviews? Yeah. They have recordings, which we already said from your days as a reporter, always get the recording.
Oh, it's 100%.
Right. But they've got it in front of them. What would the really short and sweet version of how you would advise someone to compile this information so that they can make a presentation?
So it goes back to why we had those objectives, right? So you have your research objective with sort of the subtopics. Easiest way you can do it, and this is what a lot of qualitative researchers do as sort of first pass in their work. You're just aggregating all the answers to all those topics that you've identified, right?
Yeah.
So you'll go back and if you get something transcribed and you re-listen to the tape, or there's other tools you can use like Otter AI, there's Rev, what have you. There's so many of them. But you can just use a Google Sheets. You can use a Google Doc, right? And you can just highlight a part where you read it and you're like, perfect, that answers that section. Go through the next one. Perfect, that highlight corresponds to that. And you aggregate the 6 to 7 to 10 interviews all together with those hot takes or those key takeaways, and you're finding the theme, and that's it. The challenge with that, Glenn, it just takes work, right? And everyone wants it to be done quickly. I would say doing it that way is actually one of the quickest ways you can do it, because if you've done your job out getting the research objective, getting the right topics, you've focused the conversations, you've used all the tips and tricks, you'll actually, when you go through the transcript, you'll be amazed at how quickly you're going to pull things out that are going to be valuable for you to then feed into the organization so they can make decisions with it.
Totally agree. The only thing, and you've already kind of said it, I just want to pull it out and reemphasize it, is that you're working from their words.
Absolutely.
To what you do. Because we have biases. We got to be careful that we don't, poison the well here at the very last moment and inject. And I'm holding up, for anybody watching this, a Roget's thesaurus. So old as the hills, but I've found it to be helpful because people use different words to mean something.
Absolutely.
And so, you talked about what qualitative researchers do. I think it's called coding, where you're just kind of marking the category of here's what they were talking about, and then that, short little couple of words around it is the color or sentiment around it.
Yeah.
But use a thesaurus, use something to say, well, this is a synonym for that. So these two people are kind of talking the same thing.
Absolutely.
And then you can see it and pull it into, I think you have another column that you just say, okay, well, all right, those things are all grouped around this.
Yeah. Like, so I just gave you like the really Cole's Notes version of it, but absolutely, like what I do is they call it voice of the customer work. So I pull everything out verbatim out of interview. I'll put it in a column. I'll do what you just said, which is called codifying. Because there's different ways to do qualitative research analysis, but essentially every single one of them comes down to codifying the data. It's really just a synopsis or an aggregate, right? So out of 10 answers, you'll say, this is the common theme out of these 10 answers, right? And you can either use a synonym, or you might find 7 out of 10 use the exact same word. So guess what? That's probably the word you're going to use, right? It's not rocket science. It's just sort of the process you have to go through to do this. And the reason I do it that way is I've worked in organizations where we have politics around what the customers care about. People have different beliefs. Voice of the customer work, or this work where you're getting all their insights verbatim from their own jargon and language, I show that to people as, this is why I believe this, because these 10 people have told me this, and here's what they've said.
And by doing so, no matter how political that organization is, you've just put on a Kevlar vest.
Possibly, hope so. Or it's the other way. It's people are so thankful that now the ambiguity is gone.
It melts. Yeah.
Yeah. It now you're starting from a single source of truth, as we all like to say.
Yeah. And it's so refreshing that people will likely get hooked on doing interviews regularly.
Let's hope so.
Because they realize that, resorting to the highest paid person's opinion is not the right way to keep doing this. It leads to dysfunctionality. Your culture hurts. Yeah. Instead, by saying, okay, well, our single source of truth here is what the customer says. Don't we always say that we're customer driven, customer centric?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the way to do it. Ryan, I can't thank you enough for kind of putting this all into a methodology that you follow. You mentioned already that there's a DIY course or a guide that people can go to follow it in its entirety. Where can they go?
So they can find me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm the most active. If they just type in Ryan Paul Gibson into LinkedIn, they'll find me there. And there's actually a little link in LinkedIn from my LinkedIn profile. And that goes to my website, which is contentlift.io, and you'll find it. It's called Customer Research Interviews That Don't Suck, a DIY guide. Yeah, and I'm also always happy, Glenn, just to answer people's questions. Like, if they have them, just please don't be shy to reach out. I'm always happy to help how I can.
And that's true. You actually write in the guide. It looks like many parts of it were fed by plain old people's questions.
Absolutely.
It looks like you drink your own champagne. You definitely use the voice of your customers to inform, how you talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I try to. I hope I'm doing an all right job.
Right. So that's, I think it's just the best testament to the fact that it works. Can't thank you enough for coming on.
Hey, no, thank you for having me. And second time, who knows what the third one's going to be about? Maybe I'll come with a whole new topic.
You never know.
Yeah.
Thanks again. And I trust that there's something that people came away with from this that gives them better insight into how to make their marketing even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter @Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.